1 minute. Just 60 seconds stood between the life you had lived and the life you kept postponing. You stared at the screen, watching the numbers blink, feeling nothing. No excitement, no sadness, no celebration. Just a strange emptiness, like standing at a station while a train leaves without you. People around the world were making noise. Fireworks, cheers, promises spoken loudly but meant softly. And there you were, silent. You didn't need another year. You needed a different one. As the clock hit midnight, something uncomfortable happened. Not magic, not motivation. Truth. You realized that time wasn't moving fast. You were standing still. Every goal you once wrote down, every version of yourself you once believed in, every, I'll start from next year. They all stood in front of you like witnesses. This wasn't about failure. You had survived. You had managed. You had learned how to look okay even when you weren't. But survival was never the dream. Comfort was never the plan. The truth was simple and brutal. You had been living on pause, scrolling instead of building, planning instead of acting, waiting instead of becoming. And the scariest part? No one was coming to save you. No perfect moment was arriving. No sudden miracle was scheduled for your life. This year didn't owe you anything, but you owed yourself everything. You felt it in your chest, tight, heavy, undeniable. A quiet fear mixed with something stronger than fear, responsibility. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you realize that your life is a result of your daily choices, excuses stop working. This wasn't about motivation. Motivation fades. This was about identity. Who you choose to be when nobody is watching. What you do when discipline hurts. Whether you repeat the same year 12 more times or finally break the loop. Some people let years happen to them. Others decide. And in that silent moment, standing between who you were and who you could become, a single thought took shape. Clear, sharp, unavoidable. This is not just another year. This is your year. Not because it will be easy. Not because luck will change. But because you will. The morning didn't feel special. No dramatic sunrise. No sudden confidence. No voice from the sky telling you that everything would be okay. The alarm rang, just like every other day. Your phone buzzed with notifications that didn't matter. The world continued, completely unaware that something inside you had shifted the night before. And that's how real change always begins. Quietly, you sat on the edge of the bed, staring at your hands. These hands had held dreams once. They had also dropped many of them. You realized something uncomfortable. Most of your life wasn't shaped by big decisions, but by small ones you made on autopilot. The year hadn't failed you. You had abandoned it slowly. You walked through your day like you always did, but now you were watching yourself. Watching how quickly you reached for distraction. Watching how often you avoided discomfort. Watching how easily time slipped through your fingers when you told yourself, I'll do it later. Later had stolen years from you. At some point, you sat down alone, not to scroll, not to escape, but to think. Truly think. And that's when the noise inside your head started getting louder. Regrets surfaced. Missed chances. Conversations you should have had. Risks you didn't take because comfort felt safer than courage. It hurt. But for the first time, you didn't run from the pain. You stayed with it. You let it speak. The pain wasn't there to punish you. It was there to inform you. It showed you exactly where you had betrayed yourself. Every time you chose ease over effort, approval over authenticity, and short-term pleasure over long-term growth. The version of you that once dreamed big hadn't disappeared. It was buried under habits you never questioned. And suddenly, a powerful realization landed hard in your chest. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. You had goals before. Everyone does. But your days didn't match them. Your mornings were reactive. Your nights were numb. Your weeks blurred together. So how could your life be anything but average? This year couldn't be saved by motivation. Motivation was emotional, temporary, unreliable. You had felt motivated before, after videos, books, speeches. It always faded. What you needed was something deeper. Structure. Standards. Non-negotiables. You took a deep breath and asked yourself a question that most people avoid because it demands honesty. If nothing changes in how I live my daily life, where will I be 1 year from now? The answer scared you. Same place. Same excuses. Same regrets, just older. That fear became fuel. You didn't need to fix your entire life today. That was another trap. Overwhelm leads to paralysis. You had done that dance before, setting impossible plans, failing fast, then blaming yourself. This time, the approach was different. Smaller, sharper, more intentional. You realized that identity always comes before results. You don't wake up disciplined one day. You act disciplined until it becomes who you are. You don't become confident and then take action. You take action until confidence follows. So instead of asking, what do I want to achieve this year? You asked, who must I become this year? That question changed everything. Because goals expire. Identity compounds. You wrote down one sentence. Just one. This year, I am someone who keeps promises to myself. Not big promises. Not dramatic ones. Small, Uncomfortable, daily promises. Wake up when you say you will. Do the hard thing first. Finish what you start. Stop negotiating with weakness. You knew it wouldn't feel good. Growth never does. But for the first time in a long time, you felt aligned. Not excited, aligned. And alignment is far more powerful than excitement. This year wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about rebuilding trust with yourself. Because once you trust yourself, everything changes. Opportunities feel different. Discipline feels lighter. Confidence feels earned. As the day ended, you realized something quietly profound. You weren't waiting for your year to change you anymore. You were preparing to change the year. The hardest part didn't come when you decided to change. It came when you tried to stay consistent. The first few days felt controlled, almost calm. You woke up when you said you would. You reduced distractions. You touched the work you had been avoiding. Nothing extraordinary happened, but something subtle did. You began to feel resistance. Not from the world. From yourself. Your old habits didn't disappear. They waited. Patient. Clever. They whispered in familiar tones. You deserve a break. You can do it tomorrow. One day won't matter. They sounded reasonable. That's why they were dangerous. Discipline didn't feel heroic. It felt boring. Lonely. Quiet. There were no claps. No instant rewards. Just you. Showing up when it would have been easier not to. Some mornings, you stared at the ceiling again. Same fan. Same room. But now the thoughts were different. Instead of asking, what's the point? You asked, will I keep the promise today? And that question carried weight. Every time you kept it, even in the smallest way, something shifted inside you. Not confidence, credibility. You were slowly becoming someone you could rely on. But growth has a way of testing sincerity. One evening, after a long, exhausting day, the urge to escape hit hard. You told yourself you'd earned it. One night of comfort wouldn't undo everything. Your hand hovered over the familiar distraction, the one that had stolen hours, months, years. That moment stretched longer than it should have. Because in that pause, you saw two futures. One was familiar, comfortable, safe. You had lived there before. It looked like progress without depth, dreams without action, years that ended with the same regret. The other was uncertain, demanding, uncomfortable. It required you to disappoint your weaker self to honor your stronger one. No one was watching. No one would know. And that's when you understood something most people never do. Your life is defined in moments of privacy. Not when it's easy. Not when you're inspired. But when it's just you, tired and tempted. You chose differently. Not perfectly, but deliberately. That night, you didn't feel proud. You felt calm. And calm was new. It came from alignment. The rare feeling of doing what you said you would do. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a rhythm. And with rhythm came clarity. You began to notice how much of your old life was built around avoidance. Avoiding silence. Avoiding effort. Avoiding the uncomfortable truth that potential means nothing without proof. You stopped romanticizing motivation. You stopped waiting to feel like it. You learned to act while doubting, to move while uncertain. And slowly, the internal dialogue changed. I have to do this became. I don't negotiate with this. The world didn't change yet. Your results weren't loud. But inside, something fundamental was being rewritten. Your identity was shifting. You were no longer someone who tried. You were becoming someone who practices. And practice compounds. One day, you caught yourself doing the hard thing automatically. No debate. No drama. Just action. That moment startled you more than any success ever had. Because it proved something powerful. The old version of you was losing control. Not through force, but through neglect. You weren't fighting your past self. You were starving it. By feeding discipline. By respecting time. By choosing long-term self-respect over short-term relief. And then it happened. A small external win. Something you would have once dismissed. But now, it felt different. Not because it was big, but because you knew what it was built on. Consistency. You smiled. Not wide. Not dramatic. Just enough to acknowledge the truth. This is working. Not fast. Not easy. But honestly. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a direction. You weren't chasing a perfect version of yourself anymore. You were building a real one. Progress has a strange side effect. The moment you start taking yourself seriously, the world starts testing you. At first, the doubts were quiet. They showed up as innocent questions. Is this even worth it? Are you actually good enough? What if you're wasting time and everyone else is moving ahead? You tried to ignore them. But doubts don't disappear when ignored. They wait for weakness. And weakness arrived on a random day. You saw someone else succeeding at what you had just begun. They seemed ahead, more confident, more visible, more rewarded. Their progress was public. Yours was private. And suddenly, all the discipline you had built felt fragile. Comparison crept in without permission. You told yourself you shouldn't care. But you did. Because deep down, part of you feared the truth you never said out loud. That maybe you had started too late. That maybe the gap was already too wide. That thought hit harder than any failure. Because effort is easier than uncertainty. You kept going, but now the steps felt heavier. The routine that once felt grounding began to feel repetitive. Results were slow, too slow, and the voice in your head grew sharper. See, this is why you quit before. This is where people like you level out. Not everyone gets to win. The scariest part wasn't the doubt. It was how logical it sounded. One night, you sat alone again, staring at nothing in particular. The excitement was gone. The clarity had dimmed. All that remained was commitment. And commitment is heavy when it isn't supported by visible progress. This was the phase no one talks about. The phase after motivation dies, but before results arrive. This is where most people turn back. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. They loosen standards. They skip once, then twice. Then they call it balance. Then they call it reality. You felt that pull. The old life was still there, still available, still warm and familiar. It didn't demand anything. It didn't question your worth. It let you be average without resistance. And for a moment, you wanted that peace. But then another thought emerged. Calmer, clearer, harder to ignore. If you quit now, you will have to live with the version of you who did. That thought stayed. You realized something painful and freeing at the same time. No one else was competing with you. Not the people ahead. Not the ones watching. Not the ones doubting. This year was a private contract between you and the person you refused to become. So you made a quiet decision. Not to speed up. Not to impress. Not to chase validation. But to stay. Stay with the process. Stay with the discomfort. Stay long enough to become undeniable. You adjusted expectations. You stopped measuring days and started measuring effort. You learned to respect boredom as a sign of consistency, not failure. Some days were clean. Some days were messy. But you stopped letting bad days define the year. And then, slowly, almost invisibly, something changed again. The doubts lost urgency. They still appeared, but now they felt recycled, like thoughts you had already answered through action. Comparison lost its grip because your path began to feel specific, intentional, yours. You weren't behind. You were just early in your own process. That realization didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. You understood now. This year wasn't about proving your potential. It was about surviving the middle. Because the middle is where identities are forged. And once you survive it, you don't go back. The breakthrough didn't arrive like a celebration. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly made sense. No applause. No instant recognition. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, hidden inside an ordinary day. You were doing the work, again. Same routine. Same effort. And halfway through, you realized something that stopped you for a second. You weren't forcing yourself anymore. The resistance was still there, but it no longer controlled you. The work felt normal. Not easy. Not exciting. Just necessary. And that scared you more than struggle ever did. Because it meant this wasn't a phase. It was becoming your default. You started seeing small signs. People responded differently to you. Not because you were louder, but because you were steadier. Your words carried weight because they were backed by action. When you spoke, there was less explaining, less convincing. You trusted yourself more, and others could feel it. That internal stability did something unexpected. It slowed you down in the right way. You stopped rushing outcomes. You stopped chasing proof. You worked with patience, understanding that speed without direction was just noise. One day, something external clicked. An opportunity, a result, a moment that once would have felt like luck. This time, you recognized it for what it was, the natural outcome of consistency meeting time. And here's the strange part. It didn't change you. It confirmed you. You didn't celebrate loudly. You didn't post it everywhere. You acknowledged it quietly, like a private nod to yourself. This mattered, because for the first time, success didn't feel like validation. It felt like alignment, like something that belonged to you instead of something you were chasing. But success has its own test. As soon as things started working, a new danger appeared, the temptation to relax, to assume you had crossed the line, to slowly drift back into comfort, now dressed as reward. You noticed it immediately. The voice returned, softer this time. You've earned it. You can slow down. You're not that person anymore. That voice was smarter than before, and you answered it differently. You understood now that discipline wasn't something you used to get results. It was something you protected to keep your identity intact. You didn't double down. You stayed consistent. You didn't become extreme. You became precise. The biggest shift wasn't in what you were doing. It was in what you refused to do anymore. You stopped explaining your path to people who didn't live it. You stopped seeking approval for choices that required courage. You stopped negotiating with habits that betrayed your future. Your circle changed. Not dramatically, but naturally. Some connections faded. Others strengthened. And you finally accepted that growth doesn't isolate you. It filters. One evening, as you reflected on how far you had come, a realization settled deep inside you. The old version of you couldn't handle this life. Not because it was harder, but because it required consistency without drama. You smiled at that thought, not with pride, but with respect. Respect for the process. Respect for the days no one saw. Respect for the moments you stayed when quitting felt justified. This year wasn't loud, but it was solid, and solid things last. You weren't chasing a breakthrough anymore. You had become one. You stopped confusing intensity with importance. And then, something irreversible happened. You caught yourself reacting differently to stress. Where panic once lived, there was now assessment. Where blame once appeared, there was ownership. Problems didn't disappear, but they stopped defining you. You were no longer asking, "Why is this happening to me?" You were asking, "What does this require from me?" That shift changed everything. Because responsibility isn't a burden when you choose it. It becomes direction. You began to see clearly how fragile your old life actually was, how dependent it was on mood, validation, and external circumstances. This new life required less excitement, but demanded more presence. And you preferred it. One night, the thought arrived without drama. You can't go back anymore. Not because you were too successful, but because you were too aware. You knew the cost of comfort now. You knew what it stole in exchange for ease. And once you see the trade clearly, you can't pretend you don't. This wasn't motivation. This was permanence. The standards you had set were no longer rules. They were reflections of who you had become. Lowering them would feel like lying. That's when you realized the real win of the year. Not the progress you made, but the version of yourself you made impossible to return to. The year hadn't just changed your habits. It had changed your baseline. And from here on, everything would be built on that. There comes a moment when change stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like responsibility. You noticed it in small ways. In how people listened when you spoke. In how silence around you no longer felt awkward but intentional. You weren't trying to lead anyone, but your consistency had made you visible. And visibility is uncomfortable. Because once people see you as stable, they expect stability. Once they see you as disciplined, they expect standards. You felt the weight of that expectation pressing against your chest, asking a quiet question. Can you stay this person on your worst days? That question didn't come from fear. It came from truth. The final attack of fear isn't loud. It doesn't scream failure or shame. It whispers something far more dangerous. What if this is as far as you go? You had beaten procrastination. You had built discipline. You had changed your identity. So why did this question still shake you? Because growth has stages, and this stage demanded ownership. You realized that until now, you were still reacting to your past, proving you weren't that person anymore. But now, the future required something different. Direction, not hustle, not improvement, but leadership, first of yourself, then of your life. Leadership isn't confidence. It's clarity under pressure. You had to decide what you stood for when no rulebook existed, what you would protect, what you would sacrifice, what you would walk away from, even if it cost you progress. That terrified you, because clarity removes excuses. You stopped blaming circumstances completely. You stopped hiding behind effort. You accepted that from here on, your results would reflect your decisions, nothing else. This was freedom, and freedom is heavy. One moment stayed with you. Someone asked you for guidance. Not inspiration, guidance. They saw you as someone who knew the way, and the instinct to deflect rose up immediately. To say, "I'm still figuring it out." To stay small. But you didn't. You spoke honestly, calmly, without pretending to be perfect. You shared what worked, what didn't, and what required discipline no one talks about. And in that moment, something locked into place inside you. You weren't becoming someone new anymore. You were standing fully as who you already were. Fear tried one last time. What if you disappoint them? What if you fail publicly? What if you lose what you've built? You listened. Then you answered with action. You chose to move forward anyway, not recklessly, but decisively. You accepted that leadership doesn't guarantee safety. It demands presence. You weren't responsible for outcomes. You were responsible for standards. That distinction freed you. You no longer chased growth. You embodied it. And once embodiment happens, life responds differently. Opportunities don't feel random. Challenges don't feel personal. Everything becomes feedback. You weren't asking the year for permission anymore. You were using it. And deep down you knew, whatever came next, success, failure, pressure, uncertainty, you were ready. Because you were no longer trying to become someone. You were someone. Time began to feel different. Not faster, not slower, clearer. You stopped asking how much time something would take and started asking whether it was worth the time it would take. That single shift changed how you saw everything. Work, people, commitments, even rest. Urgency lost its grip on you. Intention replaced it. You realized that most people don't waste time because they lack discipline. They waste it because they don't know what their time is building toward. You were no longer busy. You were directional. And direction creates peace. For the first time, you could look ahead without anxiety. Not because the future was guaranteed, but because you trusted the person walking into it. That trust had been earned. You began to think beyond the year. That surprised you. Earlier, surviving the year felt like the goal. Now, the year felt like a foundation. You asked harder questions. What kind of work deserves decades of effort? What values are worth being inconvenient for? What version of success wouldn't embarrass you 10 years from now? These questions didn't overwhelm you. They focused you. You understood now that legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about building something that continues without your constant force, systems, habits, standards that outlive motivation. You became patient in a way that wasn't passive. You invested in things with delayed returns. You accepted that some seeds wouldn't show growth for years, and you were okay with that. Short-term applause lost its appeal. You stopped trading long-term meaning for short-term comfort. Your relationship with time deepened. You respected it, not with fear, but with seriousness. You planned less dramatically and executed more quietly. As the year began to lean toward its end, the noise softened. Not outside, but inside you. There was less urgency to prove, less hunger to push, less fear of falling behind. You weren't slowing down, you were settling in. Like someone who finally understood the rhythm of their own breath. You started reflecting, not obsessively, not with regret, but honestly. You looked back at the person you were at the beginning of this year. Not with shame, not with pride, but with understanding. You finally saw how tired they were. How confused. How desperate for direction. Even if they pretended otherwise. That version of you wasn't weak. They were uninformed. They didn't lack potential. They lacked structure. They didn't lack desire. They lacked standards. And somehow, that realization softened something in you. You stopped being angry at your past. You stopped replaying old failures with bitterness. Instead, you saw them for what they were. Necessary steps that brought you here. Growth had replaced judgment. One night, as you sat quietly, you imagined meeting your old self. The one who stayed up late overthinking. The one who promised change next month. The one who knew something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. You didn't lecture them. You didn't motivate them. You simply thanked them. For surviving. For not giving up completely. For holding on long enough for you to take over. That was the real goodbye. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just final. You realized something profound in that moment. You didn't transform by destroying your old self. You transformed by outgrowing them. And outgrowing doesn't require hate. It requires honesty. The year felt full now. Not perfect, but complete. Even the hard days had a place. Even the moments of doubt belonged in the story. Nothing felt wasted anymore. You noticed how differently you experienced endings now. There was no panic about what comes next. No pressure to define everything ahead of time. You trusted continuity. Whatever the next year brought, you would meet it as the person you had become, not the person you used to be. That was enough. As the final days approached, you didn't rush to set new resolutions. You didn't promise dramatic changes. You understood now that real change wasn't announced, it was practiced. Quietly, daily, relentlessly. This year hadn't made you special. It had made you solid. And solidity outlasts excitement every time. You weren't closing a chapter. You were closing a cycle. And deep inside, you knew the foundation was set. The last day of the year arrived without drama. No countdown on your screen. No loud celebration waiting to happen. Just a normal day, moving at its own pace. And somehow, that felt right. You woke up and noticed how calm your mind was. Not empty, clear. The kind of clarity that doesn't ask questions anymore, because it already knows the answers. You went through the day with intention. Not rushing, not reflecting too much. Just present. Each action felt grounded, like it belonged exactly where it was. That night, you stood again at the same place where the year had once begun. Same room, same silence, but not the same person. The memories returned, not as regrets, but as markers. You saw the nights of doubt, the mornings of discipline, the moments you wanted to quit, but stayed. You saw the quiet courage it took to keep going when no one was watching. And you understood something final. This year didn't give you confidence. It gave you proof. Proof that you could choose discomfort and survive it. Proof that consistency could change identity. Proof that you didn't need a perfect life, just an honest one. As the clock moved closer to midnight, you didn't ask for anything from the next year. No big wishes. No desperate hopes. You had learned better. Years don't change lives. People do. And you were no longer waiting. When midnight arrived, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like continuation. Like stepping forward with the same pace, the same standards, into whatever came next. You weren't carrying resolutions into the new year. You were carrying identity. The world outside celebrated loudly. Inside, you stayed quiet. You had already won the only battle that mattered. You had kept the promise. Not to the world. Not to anyone else. To yourself. And that promise would outlive this year. It would shape the next one. And the one after that. And all the quiet days no one talks about. Because once you decide who you are, time stops being the enemy. It becomes the canvas. And whatever year this is, it is yours. So my dear friends, please tell me how you liked the video by commenting. Thank you.